Hello. Well, that was a quick intro. Welcome to That Was the Week. It is Friday, October the 23rd. I'm Keith Tier. And this week, we are talking all about Silicon Valley. Here's this week's That Was the Week newsletter, where the title I have chosen is All Change in Silicon Valley. And that is driven by some very important people who want to tell us how to think about building companies in the Valley. And we're going to start with our old friend, Bill Gurley. Here's Bill on Bloomberg this week talking about IPOs, founders, and his own favorite, direct listings.
Saying that companies need to go public sooner. Now we do see companies charging out of the gate, but when you look at how they're going out of the gate, I wonder if you think they're doing it the right way or not. For example, Snowflake going public, shares doubling on the first day of trading. Is that a victory or a miscalculation?
Well, look, I think any CEO that you talk to on the day of or day after a successful IPO is in a mindset of achievement and is not, and I completely understand this. They're not in a mindset of, oh, did I just make a mistake? But the process that we use to go public, if people spent the time to understand how it actually works, is the equivalent of using a paper map to do a 4-hour drive today. Like, there's just a much more elegant technology-enabled approach. And because of conflicts of interest and because there's a lot of money involved, there's a lot of people who want the broken process to exist and to continue. Unfortunately, it's getting worse. Snowflake alone was $4.5 billion. Just one company. And so the day after the IPO, the people that were allocated the stock the night before have $4.5 billion in wealth they didn't have before. And that money didn't just come out of nowhere. And unfortunately, the process is getting worse. We have a wonderful new age alternative called the direct listing that just matches supply and demand. That's how Palantir and Asana just went out on the backs of Spotify and Slack. So now we're getting some momentum around that. There's a small set of people that happen to be people that I highly respect. And the public side, it's like Rich Barton and Mark Benioff and Reed Hastings and Toby at Shopify. And if you just do Google searches, you'll see they all say the exact same thing I'm saying, which is companies are too afraid to go public. And there are massive benefits to being first in category, being public, having control of the narrative with the buy side. Spencer Rascoff wrote a long blog post on this subject, which you could also go find and read. But there were voices in Silicon Valley about 5 or 10 years ago that I think were mostly raising late stage funds and wanted to kind of to pick off the investments before they got public that started this stay private longer thing. But I've always equated it to, I always like the analogy of football, which is if there were some college quarterback that was, in the top 50 list of the draft that held a press conference and said, I don't think I'm going to go into the NFL yet because I'm really afraid of scrutiny. And, they track every single stat, and I don't want to be that short-term oriented. If someone did that, they would fall immediately. But that's the behavior of some of the founders in Silicon Valley that buy into this stay private thing. Like, the minute you started giving stock to your employees, you're in the game. And your job is to maximize shareholder value for all your constituents, your investors, your employees, everything else. And so if you don't want to keep raising your game, you should sell your company or maybe consider hiring a CEO that is.
There you go, Mr. Founders. You should hire a CEO that's prepared to do it if you're not. So Bill Gurley is on his bandwagon, and he's making the case that IPOs are stealing money from basically founders and employees. So let's just think this through a little bit. An IPO is a fundraising event, and the people who make money from an IPO are basically the people who put money in prior to an IPO. In the case of a regular IPO, that process is handled by investment banks like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, and they get their friends to buy shares in the yet to be listed company. And then on the day of the listing, all being well, the share price will go up and the people who put the money in will make a killing. That is the $4.5 billion that Gurley is referring to in the Snowflake case, because the stock pretty much doubled on the first day. The company raised $4.5 billion, and the investors who put the money in prior to the listing got the other $4.5 billion. And Gurley is saying that that's cheating. Now, he prefers a direct listing, and a direct listing is when investors like Bill Gurley, growth funds, put money into a company prior to an IPO. The company then lists on the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ, and its shares trade. Now, in that case, nobody buys shares at the IPO. They've all been bought before. And in that case, the venture capitalists, firms like Gurley's firm Benchmark, their shares trade, and their shares go up in price if the company's stock price rises. So the only difference between an IPO and a direct listing that Gurley prefers is who gets to put the money in first. Is it him, or is it the friends of Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and the other banks? And then, of course, there's the SPAC. It's interesting. This week, there was quite a bit of talk about SPACs. But let's just remind ourselves of what Gurley said. He says, at this point, the IPO process is financially brain dead. That's his point. And he makes the point that the money that goes to the investors comes out of the pockets of founders and employees. One could argue that it's a violation of fiduciary duty. Honestly, that is such BS. There is nothing in an IPO that steals money from founders and employees. It does give an alternative source of capital to the company, the venture capitalists, and that's where Gurley's self-interest comes in. He wants to be the source of capital in growth companies, and he doesn't want the friends of the banks to be doing it. So it's pure self-interest at this point. So as I was saying, then there's SPACs. This week, the Wall Street Journal published an article saying SPACs aren't a bubble. They could be here to stay. Let's read it. Many believe the meteoric rise in an asset class that basically involves handing over money in something of blind faith investment speaks more to the current frothy investment environment than the value proposition of a SPAC itself. With interest rates close to zero and expected to remain that way for the next few years, investors increasingly are swinging for the fences in the equity market. And with both holding periods and attention spans getting shorter, the SPAC is the ultimate form of immediate gratification. It enables investors to play a new trend like sports betting or automated house flipping in the case of Opendoor, for example. The second, it catches fire in the market without waiting for a young company to first demonstrate a breakout year. So the Wall Street Journal there is pointing to a lot of companies choosing to do SPACs. Chamath Palihapitiya is one of the drivers of that, and Opendoor is one of the companies he is working with to launch a SPAC. And the way it works is Chamath forms a public company, which he then raises money for. He will own roughly 20% of that company because he raised the money, just like he'd own 20% of a venture fund in terms of the fees if he was to raise a venture fund. But unlike a venture fund, which takes 10 years, a SPAC only takes 2. So he takes the money and the SPAC and he merges with a company. In the previous case, it was Virgin Galactic, and now the new targets are Clover Health and Opendoor. Once the merger is complete, the SPAC founders get diluted through the merger and end up owning, 2 to 5% of the company without having had to put any money up for that. And so again, a SPAC is really, you should focus on who gets to put the money in first. In the case of a SPAC, it's the SPAC founder, who doesn't have to put any cash up, by the way, although they can. and it's the SPAC investors who the SPAC organizers raise the money from. In a direct listing, it's venture capitalists and growth funds and some private equity funds. And in the case of an IPO, it's investors who have access to Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and the other bankers who manage an IPO. In all cases, somebody put the money in first. In all cases, the company gets cash on its balance sheet and is now publicly traded. So from the point of view of the company, all three of these methods are interesting. From the point of view of the venture capitalist, the direct listing is best. From a SPAC organizer, the SPAC is best. And if you're a bank or an institutional investor with friendships with Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, then a regular IPO is best. That is what is going on here. That's what we have hopefully demystified. Thomas Tungers this week has an article that gives some background to why this debate is so frenzied. And the fact is, as he shows, public markets are valuing growth companies more highly as a multiple of their revenue than the private markets are, especially for companies that are growing more than 30% annually, and especially for those growing 50% or more annually. He makes the point that if a company is growing 50% or more annually, it's got a 6x growth in forward multiples of their annual recurring revenue compared to the private markets. And so clearly, if you are a company growing and you are private, you should go public. What Chamath has proven is that you can do that even prior to the revenue kicking in. You can work backwards from a 2024 or 2025 set of numbers, and the market will value you highly today if you can prove that you can aggressively go after those numbers with a high probability of achieving them. And so the entire area between late stage venture capital and public markets is changing before our eyes. Silicon Valley is massively changing. And that's why this week we talk about all change in Silicon Valley. What used to be venture capitalists are becoming late stage investors via direct listings or via SPACs. I would strongly suggest that that's likely to be a growing trend. The good thing about SPACs is companies are going public earlier and getting higher multiples. So it's possible for investors like you and me to invest in them. Last week, I bought shares in IPOB. IPOB is the ticker symbol for one of Chamath's SPACs. And the shares originally were at $10. They're now at roughly $20. So you can buy into a SPAC before it's actually merged with its entity. And so this represents somewhat of a democratization of the late stage investing scene. So that was this week's News of the Week. News of the Week is basically got two elements this week. The first is about SPACs and IPOs. The second, however, relates to this. This is an article which I cover in the newsletter from Tim Wu, looking at the antitrust charges against Google. And he makes the point that Google's accused of violating Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which was passed in 1890, that makes it illegal to, quote, monopolize or attempt to monopolize a market or industry. His article is pretty balanced on both sides of this, but for me at least, this was the telling paragraph. In this case, there's very little evidence that Apple or Samsung or whoever uses the Google search engine strongly wanted to use Bing or DuckDuckGo, only to have Google bribe them not to. In other words, Google did not use its monopoly power to gain advantage for its search engine. Instead, they were glad to use Google search. They thought it was the best and were happy to have the money as well. That's what you would call a tough fact. It suggests there is something quite different compared to the Microsoft case, for example, about the dynamic here that could come out in various doctrinal ways. So Timothy Wu is basically Um, and let me get rid of this before I go on. Timothy Wu is making the point that Google really, whether or not it's a monopoly, is open to question. I actually would go further than Timothy. I do believe that in order to be a monopoly, there has to be a market that you're a monopoly in. And search is not a market. Google doesn't charge for search. The market that Google is in is advertising. That's where they make their money. And in advertising, Google's cost per click, which is one of the key measures, has been going down for several years now, whereas Facebook has been growing market share, as have Amazon, by the way, against Google in that market. So the idea that Google is a monopoly in its key market of advertising is definitely, the answer is definitely not. And so I suspect that this charge against Google, which was placed by 11 attorney generals from 11 states that are Republican, and by the Department of Justice, is politically motivated and highly unlikely to be successful. And that's quite right, because Google ultimately is something that was created by humans for humans. What did they do? They created PageRank. What did PageRank do? It counted the links inbound to any page as a measure of that page's worthiness within a topic. And the index allowed them, through keywords matched to PageRank, to put the best at the top and the worst down below. That is Google's innovation. At the time that started, I was partners with AltaVista in my company, Real Names. I partnered with Larry and Sergey shortly afterwards. And being very close to both companies, I can tell you, Google simply innovated better than anybody else. And that's why it's so big in search, because it's good. But, let's see how the future plays out. Now let's turn to our segment, Worth a Mention. Worth a Mention is basically news that you should care about, but it's different from News of the Week. It doesn't quite rank that highly. Here's this week's Worth a Mention, and there's quite a bit in it, actually. 11 reasons why Quibi crashed and burned in less than a year. That basically looks at everything that happened to Quibi. A great article by my wife Jenny on European venture capital and the trends in Q3. A story about a fund that raised $400 million here in Silicon Valley from Stanford and Harvard and invested the whole lot in Bitcoin, which turned out to be a good bet. And so it's a very positive article, but it certainly was a gamble. And therefore, the question arises, was it good? Andreessen Horowitz on doing things better versus doing things brand new. That's an old theme here in the Valley, and I agree with them that iterative improvement on something that already exists is usually far less valuable than creating something new that doesn't exist, which means that innovation is really about imagining the future, not iterating from the present. I'm a big believer in that, and for those of you who've read my How to Tell Your Startup Story, you'll know that's true. Talking of startup stories, a great piece from the Harvard Business Review on storytelling, how it can make or break your leadership. A very, very good thing about the move from office work to remote work to hybrid offices, and the impact that's going to have both in Silicon Valley from Crunchbase and in terms of what I call people analytics from the Harvard Business Review. That people analytics is basically monitoring people for good or for bad. You decide, but clearly there's a lot of possibilities of bad versions of that. Andrew Sullivan, famous conservative writer, writing on his Sully Dish on why wokeness is winning, and a bunch of other stuff. That is worth a mention, and I haven't got time to go into any detail, but if you get the newsletter, which you of course can get here, and you can subscribe to it for free, you'll be able to read all of that stuff in this week's newsletter, which will go out shortly. Now, the other important thing is, last week we talked a lot about the FCC and saying that they were going to reinterpret Rule 230 of the Communications Act in the light of Twitter and Facebook's intervention in the New York Post article regarding Hunter Biden's hard drive. And sure enough, this week, there are a bunch of responses to that. I call this echoes. And echoes, Mike Masnick admits that he may have been wrong about what rights the FCC has, but then goes on to say if he's wrong, this represents the largest growth of FCC power ever. And he argues against that. Ben Thompson at Stratechery writes very well about Twitter's responsibility and accountability, mainly to make the point that it shouldn't have any, a point of view that I agree with. David Sachs from Craft Ventures has a great piece, which is in Echoes this week. Let's go down there and take a look at that. I've got to get to Echoes first. Here we go. David Sachs talks about the fact that the Post itself should be responsible for what it publishes. And that is end of story. Nobody else should be responsible for that. So Echoes is when we continue a story that was in last week's newsletter and show the reactions this week. That is Echoes. Our startups of the week this week, there's three of them. The first is Tesla CIO, who just raised $150 million for reinventing the car dealership. Any of you who have ever bought a car know how terrible the process is. And if you've ever sold one, it's even worse. So what this company is doing, it's called Tekion, is building a SaaS software platform that car dealerships can use in order to sell cars. And it does everything you'd expect a car dealership to do. There's some great quotes in the article from dealers. I have to choose my words carefully, says Joe Castellino of Stevens Creek Volkswagen, when asked about the management software on which most car dealerships rely for inventory information, marketing, customer relationships, and more. He basically did choose his words carefully, but he was saying that the whole shebang sucks. And so this former CIO from Tesla clearly is onto something. Airbnb is the second startup of the week. And the reason is Scott Galloway, known as Prof. Galloway to his friends, is saying that Airbnb may well be the most valuable leisure company ever. And he expects it to IPO soon. And by the way, Bill Gurley in the interview I just showed you echoes that. He thinks they will too. And Airbnb has 7 million rooms under management compared to all of the top hotel chains between them only having 4.5 million. That's the basis for his contention. Again, that is in the newsletter this week. Startups of the week. That was that. Now we have a question from one of our viewers this week. Here's Andrew Keith.
Keith, it's certainly been quite a week in tech, and the question this week that really intrigues me most of all is PayPal's embrace of crypto, or seeming embrace. What I don't understand, and perhaps you can explain this to me, is how you can use crypto to pay for things. So if I want to buy a new iPhone or a new camera, or if I want to buy some food online, a restaurant takeaway, or some tickets or a subscription, how do I use crypto? My understanding is that crypto is not a currency. So this supposed marriage between PayPal and crypto seems to me to be somewhat forced and weird. Perhaps you can explain that to me in this week in which everybody at least is saying that crypto hit mainstream.
So yeah, that's Ask Me Anything. And Andrew, great question. Crypto is a word that describes actually quite a number of different things. Firstly, traditional Bitcoin and Ethereum, which came afterwards, which you could think of as the foundation of crypto. But there's a whole lot of other layers on top of that. For example, today there are many tokens known as stable coins. One of them is called USCD. Another one is USCT. These coins are digital currencies that are backed up by dollars. And so for every USDC, there is a dollar held in a vault that backs it up. But unlike the dollar, it's a digital token and can be moved around and act as a digital store of value. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of financial services known as DeFi. DeFi stands for distributed finance. So if you go to Celsius.network or if you go to BlockFi, you'll find that you can put your USDC tokens in there, and they will pay you up to 15% a year interest on them, backed up by dollars, remember, when the interest rate on the high street through your bank is close to 0%. And so crypto describes lots of different things. The question, how can you buy stuff with crypto, is really a function of the platforms that let you store crypto, creating payment services. So for example, Coinbase Commerce lets me sell my newsletter subscription for Bitcoin or Ethereum or USDC for that matter. And you can go to my Coinbase Commerce site and you can pay for my newsletter using your digital wallet. And if it has Bitcoin or Ethereum in, you can use that to pay. So that's direct payments. But what PayPal is doing is something a little bit different. PayPal is basically allowing you to pay for something in crypto, and it will pay the merchant in dollars. So it's acting as a middleman, receiving crypto from the buyer and giving dollars to the seller in an instant conversion between the two, thus removing much of the risk. That's a growing trend, and I expect it will grow a lot more in the weeks and months to come. I hope that answered your question. If you would like to ask me a question that you want me to answer, please go to our Telegram channel, t.me/thatwastheweek, and you can post questions there. You can even post videos there if you record them. And I will do my best to pick some interesting ones to respond to. And now to finish, it's Tweet of the Week time. And this week's Tweet of the Week is from Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks is now 94 years old. And let's let Mel speak for himself, shall we?
Hi, folks. I'm Mel Brooks, and behind me you see my son and my grandson. And they can't be with me. Why? Because of this coronavirus. And Donald Trump's not doing a damn thing about it. So many people have died. And when you're dead, you can't do much. So I'm voting for Joe Biden. I like Joe. Why do I like Joe? Because Joe likes facts. Because Joe likes science. Joe will keep us going. Take a tip from me. Vote for Joe. Okay, that's all I've got to say. Okay, you can leave. Thank you. Thank you. See you soon. I got to fill out my ballot. See you later. Bye-bye. Yeah, I love you too. That was good.
So there you are. There you have it. Mel Brooks tells you to go and vote. That's it from me this week in what is a new format for That Was the Week. And we'll see you all again next week. Bye for now.